This session is on the project lifecycle. So welcome everybody to this knowledge pool training session. This is the second session in our Introduction to Project Management course. So we're going to be looking at the project lifecycle today. We've got our housekeeping rules as per usual, and thank you for all arriving on time. So in this session, we're going to look at the life cycle of a project, the purpose of each stage within a project, and what work is typically done within each stage. So I'll deliver this presentation and we'll provide opportunities for you to increase and test your knowledge of the material presented. There are 2 assignments as well as part of this. When I looked earlier today, I could only see assignments from Elsie. If anyone's having trouble with the assignments, if they message me on Telegram, I will try to help out with that. So the payoff of this session will be that you have a good understanding of the purpose of each stage within a project, and you'll be able to describe the key deliverables within each stage. Because all projects have a life cycle. And what we've got on the screen at the top is the project life cycle that Knowledge Pool regards all projects as having. And the life cycle starts with the startup phase, and we'll look at what the startup stage is, because it's not really a stage, but you need to understand what happens before the project starts. This life cycle is a form of waterfall model in that the project flows from left to right and the flow never reverses. However, as we'll see in other sessions, agile projects, they do follow this life cycle, but they do iterate around within their delivery phase. And we'll be studying the agile method later in the course. So each stage has a specific purpose, and to achieve the purpose of the stage, there are certain key activities that need to be completed within each stage. And dividing a project up into these stages is a technique that's been proven over many years and many thousands of projects to be necessary. Projects that don't follow these stages are much more likely to fail because they run the risk that vital activities that are particular to each stage are not completed. So it's not uncommon for different organisations or even different methodologies to give these stages different names. For example, initiation might be called idea or shape, planning might be called plan, delivery might be called deliver or execution, and close down might be called review or evaluation. But despite those different names, the work that's done in those stages is generally the same. And it's important that you understand the purpose of each stage and what the key activities are. And we'll look at those over the next few slides. So our first slide here is talking about startup. Now, startup isn't a stage within the project. Rather, it is the activities that are done within BAU to create the project. And we talked 2 weeks ago what business as usual or BAU means, because BAU is the normal cycle of activities that a business will go through. And starting projects is a very regular thing that businesses do. It isn't done to a timetable, but it is done very regularly as and when a new project is needed. And we have a startup phase because projects require money and resources. They generally have to be approved to start before the initiation stage of the project can actually start. So in the startup period, the approval of the project takes place, and the startup activity should be ensuring that at least a basic business case exists for the project and that funding and resources that are needed for the initiation stage are approved. And again, in our session 2 weeks ago, we talked about what a business case was, and I said it was the reason why the project was required. So it's the rationale for the project, and it's always a good idea that the business case for a project is documented so that everyone can see what the stated rationale for the project is. And so one of the startup activities should be to ensure that a basic business case exists, and if it doesn't, to write one. And it should make sure we have the funding and resources for the initiation stage to be able to start. And it's not uncommon in projects to find that the funding for the project is approved one stage at a time. So in the startup phase, the funding for initiation would be approved. In the initiation stage, the funding for the planning stage would be approved. In the planning stage, the funding for the delivery stage would be approved, and so on. So this method or this approach of approving the funding in stages gives the organisation more control over the cost, because it knows that it's only approving the next stage that needs to happen. That next stage will do more planning, typically. That will help refine the costs of the project, and hence when approval is asked for the next amount of funding that's needed for the project, there will be a much better idea as to how much the project is going to cost. It will be a more accurate estimate of what the project costs are. So it's very common to find that funding is approved in stages as well. Are there any questions on the startup period? These activities that happen before the project actually starts. Okay, so one of the activities in startup will be to appoint a project manager, so that when the project starts, it enters the initiation stage, there is a project manager in place whose job it is to make the initiation stage happen and deliver what should be present as a result of initiation. So we'll move on. So the next stage is the initiation stage. And the purpose of the initiation stage is to complete the business case, if this is necessary. Sometimes the startup activity will deliver a fully formed business case, but most often it will just make sure that there is a basic business case, and it will be the work of the initiation stage to complete that in all the detail that a business case would normally have in it. Because a business case, in saying why the project is needed, should also consider the value of the project to the business, and also what the likely cost of the project is going to be. Now, it will be very difficult at the initiation stage to know what the project is going to cost, but still we have to try and make some sort of effort to estimate what the cost is going to be, because if we don't, then we're missing an opportunity to say, well, actually this project is going to cost a lot more than it would ever be worth to the business. So very often during the initiation stage, one of the activities is to validate the business case. If we have a business case, we need to validate it and make sure that it makes sense. Does it actually justify the project? Once we have a valid business case, it would be good practice to review that business case at all stages through the project, at least until we are a long way through the delivery stage. Once we reach the end of the delivery stage, the project has delivered what it's going to deliver, and there's not much point then reviewing and validating the business case. But it's during initiation that the bulk of the work to build and validate the business case is done. So the next purpose of the initiation stage is to understand the problem or the opportunity or the need that the project has been set up to solve. And I just want to ask a question to everybody. And the question is, why would we want to understand the problem or need during initiation? Can I throw that question out to you all?
Hi, Tony.
Hi.
I'm not sure, but I will try.
Okay.
Okay, I will say that the reason to understand the problem from the initiation stage is so that to give accurate planning of the project.
Yes, I would say that that's exactly right. That you have to understand the problem that you're trying to solve to be able to plan the project. If you don't understand the problem that you're trying to solve, you may undertake the wrong tasks. You may miss some tasks that are necessary. There are various mistakes that you might make in planning the project if you don't understand what the problem or the opportunity or the need is that the project has been set up to solve or to take advantage of. Okay, so it's a fairly obvious question that for the project to deliver what's needed, we have to set about understanding the problem. And the sooner we do that, the sooner we can start to plan the project properly, and the sooner we can put the right activities in place to solve that problem or take advantage of the opportunity. So the next purpose of the initiation stage is to decide on what approach will be taken to address the problem or opportunity. And again, I have a question for you, which is, why do you think we need to decide on the approach that we're going to take to solve the problem? Any thoughts?
Maybe so that we don't beat around the bush, so that we don't waste time.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, which is there may be different approaches that could be taken. There may be 3 or 4 different ways to solve a particular problem. You might pay another company to do the work so you don't have to. You might employ more staff if that's going to solve the problem. You might employ some new technology to solve the problem. So there are different ways that you might set about solving a problem. And if you don't decide early on in the project what approach you're going to take, if you try to take lots of different approaches, I think you would waste time trying to plan a number of different projects, almost a number of different ways of solving the one problem. So our experience tells us that it's better to decide in the initiation stage what the approach that we're going to take to solve that particular problem or to take advantage of the opportunity is going to be. And once we set the approach, all of the tasks that are then needed to take that approach then follow from that. So it does stop us beating around the bush, as you say. We pick the approach we're going to take and we move forwards. Because the approach we take will change the tasks that are needed in the project. If we're going to buy some new software to solve the problem, there's a whole set of different tasks that it will be necessary than if we're going to employ some extra staff to solve the problem. If we employ extra staff, we'll need to hire them, we'll need to train them. Whereas if we are solving the problem by software, then it's a different set of tasks. So the next purpose of the initiation stage is to assess the feasibility of delivering something that will solve the problem. So if we think there is an approach that can solve the problem, why would we need to assess the feasibility of delivering the solution? Well, I think the answer is that the approach may be valid and it may work in many organizations, but our organization is not the same as any other organization. So we have to assess whether an approach that may have worked elsewhere can it actually work in our organisation? Can we afford it? Do we have the skills to solve the problem in that way? And this is why, if there is any question as to whether the project can deliver something that will solve the problem, the work of assessing the feasibility will usually be done in the initiation, so that if we find that it's not feasible to solve the problem in the way we were thinking, we can choose a new approach, check that that's feasible, and if we find that's feasible, we can move forward with that new approach. So one of the actions within initiation is to assess the feasibility of something that can be delivered that will solve the problem in our organisation. Now, the feasibility may need a study to be done, and it might result as well in us understanding more about the problem. So that process of assessing feasibility can be a very useful process in understanding the problem a bit more. The next purpose of the initiation stage is to agree what deliverables are needed within the business to solve the problem. So we understand a bit more about the problem, what the problem is. We know how we're going to try to approach solving it, and we think it can be done. But we need to identify what are the things that are needed in the business in order to solve that problem. And we call those things deliverables because the project is going to deliver them, and it's going to do that in its delivery stage. So just check something. So the next purpose in initiation is to create the management structure for the project. As I mentioned, the startup period will normally result in a project manager being assigned, but it's in the initiation stage the rest of the management structure from the project will be set up, and that will probably include the setting up of a steering group and regular meetings for the steering group. It may involve setting up other decision-making forums, and it may involve setting up other roles within the project, such as a lead business analyst or a lead architect or other management roles within the project. So that creation of the management structure would be done during initiation. The next purpose would be to plan the subsequent stage. So during initiation, one of the tasks is to plan the planning stage. The planning stage, as we'll see shortly, is when most of the planning happens. But during initiation, we have to plan for the planning stage. And so we're assessing what tasks need doing. We're assessing how big those tasks are. We're assessing what resources we need, what people are needed to undertake those planning tasks. And we create a project plan. And we may create other parts of the project plan, such as a finance plan that tells us how much money we need for the planning stage. And we do that so that we can gather the team we need and the funding that we need for the next stage. And only when we've got that team and funding approved does the initiation stage finish, and we then move into the planning stage. So can I just ask, are there any questions on the purpose of the initiation stage? Because it's in that initiation stage when the project team starts to come together and think about the problem, think about how they're going to solve it, and think about what deliverables are going to be needed, and start to plan the delivery of the project. So any questions on the initiation stage?
Hi, Tony. About the visibility of delivering something that will solve the problem, one of the points that you mentioned, is it possible like that you can give like a scenario to back that up for clearer understanding? Do you understand what I mean?
Yes, I do understand. Thank you. It's a good question. So if we think about the CRM project that we're running within our own organization, the approach that we're taking is to look to buy a software service that will be our CRM system. That's our sort of basic approach to how we're trying to solve the problems that we've identified that have led to the decision that we need a CRM system. But the question is, can an organization that is as small as us, can we find a CRM solution that we can afford to buy? Is there anything out there that would be available at the sort of price that we could afford to pay? And so in assessing the feasibility of buying a CRM service for Knowledge Pool, we could look at the marketplace and we could say, well, even without understanding very much about CRM systems, we can see that there are CRM systems that are free. We can see that there are CRM systems that have a very low cost. So yes, we think it will be feasible for us to find something that will meet most of our requirements for a cost that we can afford. And that's what I mean by assessing the feasibility. So we're not doing a detailed investigation. We're not proving that the problem can be solved in that way, but we are assessing the likelihood that it can be solved in that way. And only if it's very likely would we move forwards. If it was a risk that our approach couldn't solve the problem, we would perhaps look at different approaches, and we might talk to the steering group about whether we need to take a different approach. Does that give you enough of an idea as to what we mean by assessing the feasibility?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah? Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, Tony.
Hi.
Yeah, when you said one of the purpose of completing, one of the purpose of the initiation stage is to complete the business case.
Yeah.
Does the project charter comes under that as well?
Yes. So the idea of a project charter or a project mandate, not every methodology and not every organization defines the need for such a document, but it's not uncommon that all of these questions, or some of these questions anyway, some of the purposes of the initiation stage, they are actually achieved by delivering either a project mandate or a project charter. So for example, understanding the problem, deciding on the approach, assessing the feasibility, agreeing the deliverables, and creating the project management structure, they will often be captured in a project charter or a project mandate, or possibly something called a project initiation document. Yeah. So what I've seen most often is that the business case tends to be its own standalone document, and stands alone from anything else that's produced in initiation. But these other things, like understanding the problem, deciding the approach, assessing feasibility, they're often captured in the form of a project initiation document, which is sometimes called a project charter or project mandate. And I would say that if you start working in an organization that doesn't require the creation of such a document, I would think about creating one anyway, because it's a really useful thing to have, something that at the outset of the project sets out what we know about the project, how we think we're going to solve the problem, what deliverables we're going to try and create. Because when you collect all of that information together, it becomes a very useful document for anybody that the project wants to engage, and for anybody joining the project as a business analyst or a project manager, perhaps taking over the project, or a software developer or a tester. for them to have that one document where all the information is collected together that says what the problem is, what the approach is, how we've assessed the feasibility and what deliverables we're creating and how the project's management structure is organised. That's enormously useful to have one document that does pull it all together. So I think I've got a slide later on that does talk about a project initiation document. So we'll perhaps come back to that question. And if you still have a further question about it, ask the question at that time.
Thank you, Tony, for that.
Okay, no problem. So just before we move on, can I perhaps just ask one other question of you? So how keen do you think the business will be about the project during the initiation stage? Any thoughts about how it? You don't understand?
No, I don't understand the question.
Okay, so I was asking about how keen do you think the business will be? So what I mean is, how interested in the project will business people be generally? If you consider sort of anybody in the business, how interested will they be in the project at the start of the project?
Yeah, when they think about the returns, the benefit they're going to get from the project, that will give them the seal to carry on with the project, as in to get involved in the project.
I think you're right that for some people, for the people in the business who know what the project is trying to solve, what problem the project is trying to solve, they will be very interested in the business because they will want those benefits. They will want the thing that the project has been set up to deliver. So the people who understand why the project exists will be very interested in it. They'll be very keen to be involved in the project. They'll be very keen to make sure that the project delivers exactly what they want. But it will also be the case that some people in the business won't have even heard of the project. So there may be people in parts of the business that are unaffected by the problem that the project's been set up to solve, who just won't be aware of the project. And obviously with those people, the interest is going to be quite low. So as a project manager working on a project, one of your jobs is to manage the interest and expectations that people have of the project. So you might need to communicate with people who don't yet know about the project, but you might also have to explain to people who are very keen on the project, who are desperate for their problem to be solved, that it will take time to solve their problem, but you need their help. And it's a good idea to explain when you're going to need help from them so that they can be ready to help the project at the time they need it. Because the business people who want the project are very keen, they may become quite frustrated if the project manager is insisting that certain documents are created during the initiation stage, because the business people see this as being a delay. They see that their problem isn't yet solved, and so they get worried and they get frustrated. So what the project manager needs to do is emphasize that if we are to deliver the required outcomes in the business, then it's a proven technique that we create these deliverables during the initiation stage. We create a project initiation document. We create a plan for the next stage. We gather the team. Those things aren't slowing us down. They're helping us deliver the project as well as it can possibly be delivered. And the project manager needs to communicate that to anybody who might be frustrated about how long the project seems to be taking to get going, because that frustration is very common and very real. So just before we move on to planning, I'm going to talk a little bit more about deliverables, because very often when a project is started, what the business people actually have is a vision of where the business needs to go to. They know they need a better way of doing something, but they don't really know more than that. And we say that they have a vision, and the business leaders can see where it is they want to go, but they don't necessarily know how to get there. And in order to arrive at what deliverables the project needs to actually deliver to the business, we have to think about what the vision is, what the outcomes are that are needed. So the outcomes are things like, we want more money, we want customers to be happier, we want to beat our competition. These are the sorts of outcomes that you might want from a particular project. And once we've identified what the outcomes are that we need, whether those outcomes are more profit or dominance of a particular marketplace or a better work-life balance for employees or the directors, we need to think about then what are the actual deliverables necessary in order to achieve those outcomes. And I think perhaps to understand these concepts, it's probably worthwhile thinking about knowledge pool and looking at what knowledge pool's vision is. We can think about the outcomes of what we need from our CRM project, and we can then think about the deliverables. So our vision within knowledge pool is to support people in Doncaster to get better jobs, to become more employable, to get better paid jobs. So we're seeking to improve people's employability. We're seeking to improve their career progression if they're employed. We're seeking to increase the quality of jobs that people can aspire to. And we're seeking to help all the people who want to be helped. And I think if we can also help other church parishes that want to reuse our knowledge to help their community, then that would be another good outcome for us. So we can identify some outcomes that we're trying to achieve that are as a result of our vision of making things better for people in Doncaster. So what do we need a CRM system for? Well, the thing is that we need to be able to find people who need training. And so we need to undertake some marketing activities, and having found those people, we need to undertake some sales activities. We need to persuade them to click on a buy button to buy some training from us. Even if we don't make a charge, we need to sell the benefit of a training course from Knowledge Pool to those people. So we need to undertake sales and marketing activities. And hence we need to organize those activities. And what we know from general business knowledge is that one of the ways of organizing sales and marketing activities is to use a CRM system, a customer relationship management system, because such systems have the features within them that allow you to organize your sales and marketing efforts. And so that's why we need a CRM, is to get those outcomes for people, because we have to be able to find people, and we have to be able to find organizations that can refer those people to us. So the deliverables that we need are things like, we need a working CRM system. So that's our first deliverable. We need a working CRM system. But then we also need staff who are trained to use that system. Just having the system itself isn't going to produce the outcomes we need. We have to have people who are trained to use the CRM system, who know how to operate it, in order to have those outcomes of finding people that need training and finding organizations that can refer people to us. So our first deliverable would be a CRM system. Our second deliverable would be trained staff. Now, how do we train the staff? Well, it's conceivable that we would want to give them some training. So another deliverable might be a training course. We might produce a training course, which might be a script and some slides, such as I'm using with you tonight. So that would be our third deliverable, would be a training course. A fourth deliverable might be a training plan. So that would be a schedule of what dates we were going to train which people on how to use the CRM system. So we've got at least 4 deliverables that we need for our CRM system. And this is what any project will do, is it will start with the vision that's set out as to what the project is trying to achieve. It will think about what outcomes are desired within the business. And they will think about what are the very specific things that the business needs if those outcomes are going to be made possible. So the purpose in this slide is to explain that during the initiation stage, there is a process that we follow to decide what deliverables are going to be needed. We start by looking at a high-level vision as to where the business is going, what it wants to try and achieve with the project. We then think about what outcomes are needed within the business, whether that's more money, more time, more quality, whatever those outcomes are. And we then need to think about what are the things that are actually going to make those outcomes happen. And they're the deliverables. So the project delivers the deliverables, and whether those outcomes actually happen or not is then down to the business, because the project delivers its deliverables, which might be a CRM system, it might be some training, it might be a training schedule, it might be a training course. But only if the system is used properly and if there is some management attention to using the system will we actually get the outcomes we need. So at the end of the project will have delivered what it needs to, but it's then up to the business to take those deliverables and use them to achieve the outcomes. And hopefully if the outcomes are achieved, then the vision will be achieved as well, because the outcomes have flowed from the vision and the deliverables have flowed from the outcomes. So are there any questions on this slide on outcomes and deliverables? Okay, right. So our next stage that we need to think about is the planning stage. And I've already mentioned it's in the planning stage that the majority of planning and design happens. So the main purpose of the design stage are to confirm the business requirements for the delivery stage. So for these deliverables that we need, what are the business requirements? And we're basically going down into more detail. So in initiation, we decide we need a CRM system. In planning, we decide what are our business requirements for the CRM system. Having decided what our requirements are, we can move on to design a deliverable that is going to ideally meet all of the requirements. And having designed the deliverables, we're then in a position to then plan the next stage, which is delivery. But actually in planning, we do also plan the close down stage. And the reason that we plan those 2 stages at once is actually the close down stage is actually a very small stage. As we'll see later, the close down stage doesn't have a lot of tasks in it, doesn't have a lot of activity. So we can plan it during the planning stage. And because we've planned it, at the end of delivery, we can move straight into the close down phase. It's very, very unusual to need any extra resource during the close down phase. It's normally the case that at the end of delivery, the project is able to return a lot of resource to wherever it came from. Usually only a very little amount of resource is needed for the close down phase. So we can plan it during the planning phase. So we plan the delivery stage and we plan the close down stage. And in a similar way to during the initiation, the last bit of the planning stage is to actually gather the team and gather the funding. So, purpose of the planning stage are these four things. The first of which is to gather the business requirements for delivery. Now, we should mention Agile at this stage, because if we're using an Agile approach, one of the benefits of Agile is that you don't need to discover all of your requirements at the outset of the project. So you don't need to find all your requirements during planning. You can go into the delivery stage not knowing what some of your requirements are, but knowing that you have people from the business who are working as part of the project, who during delivery will tell you what their requirements are, and the project will hopefully be able to deliver those requirements for them. So during the planning stage, if we are going to be taking an Agile approach in delivery, it's likely that only the most important high-level requirements would be gathered during planning. The remainder of the business requirements would be gathered during delivery. And if we know that we're going to be taking an Agile approach in delivery, during initiation, when we're thinking about how long the planning stage is going to take, we will have assumed the planning stage can be shorter than a normal project or a waterfall project, because we're only going to gather the most important higher level requirements during planning, and all the other requirements are going to be gathered during delivery. So it makes our planning stage shorter.
So, Tony.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I want to find out, like, if when we adopt the Agile approach, and at the planning stage, if we have defined our requirements, and let's assume that we have taken a decision, for example, on the type of CRM software at this stage. Now, we'll take it that our high-level requirement will have informed the choice of the software that we want to procure. Now, when we get to delivery stage, I will now discover that maybe there are other requirements. If these other requirements do not flow into the choice of the CRM that we have made, how do we address that? Sure.
That's a very good question. So, I think the problem is addressed in two ways. The first is that, and we'll go on to talk in a separate session about risks, but during initiation, you would hope that the project would identify exactly the risk that you've identified, which is that we choose a CRM system at the planning stage when we haven't got all the requirements, and we find a requirement in delivery that CRM system can't meet. And so if you identify that risk during initiation, you need to think about how you'd mitigate that risk. And what you would hope is that the project would think about what sorts of requirements they might have that might come up during delivery that would mean that a choice of CRM at the planning stage would not be correct. And that's actually quite difficult. It's a difficult thing to imagine what you might miss. because if you're likely to miss it, it's already a sort of blind spot for you. And it's difficult to know the things that you don't know. But if you know that there are things that you don't know, then you can have a think about what are the ways that we might prevent ourselves from making a mistake. And the project might decide, as a result of identifying that risk during initiation, it might decide to do a bit more work in planning, and it might decide to perhaps try and gather some more requirements. It might try and go to a slightly lower level of detail, or it might try and make sure that it's gathered at least one requirement under every sort of category of heading. We'll see this with our CRM software, that within CRM software, there are lots of different functions that you might do. There are some sales functions, there are some marketing functions, there are some collaboration functions. So the project might say, well, let's make sure that we've got a sales requirement, a marketing requirement, and a collaboration requirement. And hopefully that way we can avoid picking a CRM solution at the planning stage that can't meet our requirements. Now, a better way to do it might be to say, well, what's our most difficult requirement? What's going to be the most difficult requirement to meet? If we can identify the most difficult requirement to meet, or the most difficult requirement under each of those headings, if we pick some software that can definitely meet the most difficult requirement, then in theory, any other requirement that might come out in delivery should be possible for the software to meet. And that's a great aspiration, but of course it is difficult to imagine what the most difficult requirement that you're going to have is going to be. Because until you found them all, how do you judge which is going to be the most difficult? You just don't know. And so the project during initiation should take a view as to how likely is it that we're going to pick the wrong CRM system? How likely is it that we're going to come up with a requirement that the CRM system we've picked can't meet? If that likelihood is high, then perhaps Agile is not the right approach for the project. And so you might move to a waterfall approach where during planning, you gather all the requirements and you evaluate all the CRM systems to prove that the one you're picking can meet all of your requirements. Yeah. So that's one way, is to identify the risk during an initiation, assess the risk, assess how likely it is that you will pick the wrong CRM, and then decide whether that is going to cause you to change your approach from Agile to Waterfall so that you can gather all the requirements and make sure. The other approach that you could take is you could say, well, we will take the risk that we pick the wrong CRM. And if we find a requirement that CRM can't meet, when we find that requirement, we will find a CRM system that can meet that requirement, and we will change to using that other system. That would be an Agile approach, because it suggests that we are flexible enough to be able to try one system until we find it doesn't work for us, and then quickly switch to a different system. Whether it's possible to switch quickly will depend to some degree on how much work has been done during delivery. If you find the requirement towards the end of delivery, when you've done most of the work, it's obviously going to be a lot harder to switch to a different product at that stage. And I have seen situations where perhaps a problem has come out late in delivery, and what the steering group for the project has decided they will do is they will go live with the system as it is, with the requirement that can't be met, and then they will start another project, and that second project will select the next CRM that's going to replace the first CRM, and that second project will migrate all the data that is in the first system to the second system, do the training on the second system. It's clearly an inefficient process, but if the requirement is important enough to achieving those outcomes, then that could be the right decision. So I do think there are two ways in which you might address that risk, but it is a big risk with Agile, particularly where you are selecting a software product where you perhaps don't have the resource to undertake fundamental changes to the system. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that's okay. Thank you very much, Tony.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, thank you for that. So the design stage of the design element within planning is really making sure that we have some idea of what it is we're going to build. And we need to think about the design stage if we're using Agile, because again, using Agile in the same way that Agile would discover most of its requirements during delivery, Agile would also do most of its design work during delivery as well. So the design that we would do during planning, sorry, excuse me, I've just got a phone call coming through. I've not got my phone on silent. I've turned that off now. Sorry about that. So the design work that we do during the planning stage, if we're using Agile, is really it's a high-level design for how different elements of the solution that we've identified are going to work together. So, for example, if we're going to buy our CRM system, we might have to do some design work as to how it will interface with our website. And the purpose of the design work is to say, this is how the two things are going to work together. And we do the design work so that there is a bit of a blueprint, something written down that the person who is building the connection between the systems can understand how the two systems are supposed to work together. So if we're using Agile during the planning stage, we will do some design, but it will be very high level design, and it will be really designing the connection between components. It won't be designing individual components, because we can do that during delivery, but it will be designing the connection between components, because we need to understand how those things are supposed to connect together. And then finally, just to wrap up on the planning stage, can I just ask, I asked earlier about how keen we thought the business people would be about the project during initiation. Can I ask the same question about how keen you think they would be during the planning stage? How interested or...
Hello.
Hi.
I think they'll be very keen because like proper planning will prevent any wrong performance as they go on.
Yeah. I think that's right. Once people have put effort into the project to plan it, to define what deliverables they need, to define the business requirements, once they start to see some designs and they start to see what the thing might look like, they can become more interested in it because they're more invested in it. But the planning process, again, doesn't result in actually anything the business can use to solve their problems. All it results in is a plan and some designs. So again, there can be some frustration within the business community that things are taking too long. And again, it's really the job of the project manager to reassure people that it's only by planning properly that we can prevent that poor performance that would result if we moved into delivery too soon. By having a proper planning stage, it means that when we start to deliver, we know what it is we're trying to deliver, we know how things are supposed to connect together, and we have a plan as to how long the delivery stage is supposed to take. So that would be sort of my view as to how enthusiastic the business would be. On the one hand, they'll be very keen because they've done more work on the project, but they will also be frustrated about the fact that there is still nothing delivered that is going to help them. So we have to keep reassuring them that things are on track, things are going to plan, and that this approach is necessary and has proven itself time and time again to be the best way to deliver projects reliably. Okay, so I think we can move on to the delivery stage. So within the delivery stage, the purpose of delivery is to define any outstanding requirements, to build and test the deliverables that have been designed, and to implement these deliverables in the business, and then to support the business through using those deliverables, because that will be a change for them. When we give these deliverables to the business, they'll have to start using them, they'll have to start doing things in a different way, and they will need some support probably to do that. And in some organisations, the delivery stage is actually split into an implementation stage as well, so that in the first part of delivery, we define any outstanding requirements and build and test the deliverables. And then during an implementation stage, we implement the deliverables and we support the business through the change. And even when the delivery stage isn't split into an implementation stage and a delivery stage, it's often the case that there really does need to be a detailed plan for all the implementation actions. The implementation actions can be very time specific. Things can need doing at a very specific time. So for example, if we've turned a new software system on, say over a weekend, we need to tell the business on Monday morning from whenever the business opens, use the new system, don't use the old system. And so it's very often that we create a very detailed plan just for the implementation activities that occur at the end of the delivery stage when we're implementing the deliverables into the business. So there's lots happening in the delivery stage. Now, if we're using Agile, Agile is basically an iterative approach where we decide that we're going to undertake small chunks of work, and we decide how long those chunks of work are going to take. 2 weeks is a common period, and they call those chunks of work sprints. So the project will decide that it's going to undertake a number of 2-week sprints during the delivery stage, and it's during those sprints that the requirements are gathered, deliverables are built that meet the requirements and tested, and then if we like those, we'll move on to the next sprint, or if there's a problem in the next sprint, we might correct the problems. And so each sprint is a process of deciding what requirements are going to be met in that sprint, building some deliverables, testing some deliverables, and proving that those requirements have been met before we then move on to the next sprint. And depending on how long the delivery stage is going to be, there might be 1 sprint, there might be 20 sprints, but the number of sprints multiplied by the duration of the sprints will tell you the duration of the delivery stage to a large part. If there are implementation activities at the end, then you may need to assess the implementation period. Implementations tend to be quite quick in that the business very often can't withstand having two different systems in use at the same time, or two different ways of doing things. So often there will be there'll be a point at which the business changes from doing things one way to doing things another way. And the remainder of the implementation period is a support period where the business is helped to adjust to that new way of doing things. And it is possible that you can implement changes part way through delivery. So you might build something, test it, and decide that it can go live. And then you might do another sprint where you build something else, build it, test it, and then that thing goes live. That's also possible with an agile delivery model. So are there any questions about delivery? Okay. Just realised I've forgot. Hi, yes, go ahead.
In relation to this CRM project that we are on,
yes,
is it agile or waterfall methodology that we are using?
Yeah, so we're trying to use agile with it.
Okay.
And that sort of knowledge pools approach is we will try to use agile where we can, but it's during the project initiation that we will consider whether there are risks to using agile and whether those risks are too great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so I was going to mention that it's also the case that some of the activities at the end of delivery, they might be referred to as handover activities. And a handover activity occurs when something that was under the control of the project, so maybe a software system, is then handed over to a team within the business to manage in future. So during the delivery stage, if we're talking about a software project, the project will be in control of the software, what changes are made to it, how those changes are released. But at the end of the project, if that system is to remain viable, the ownership of that system, the responsibility for making changes to it, will need to be handed over to a team within the business or a team within IT. So we sometimes talk about handover activities. And the idea is there that at the end of delivery, the project hands over responsibility for something that it's been responsible for to a team in the business that is now going to be responsible for it. And you'll notice that one of the purpose of the delivery stage isn't to plan and gather the resources for the close down phase. We do that work at the end of the planning stage. We do it for close down, even though we're looking 2 stages ahead, because it's possible to do it. So it's a bit of an efficiency thing where we do it at the end of planning, and then we know what resource we need. We know what the cost of the close down stage is going to be. It's all planned at the end of planning, and we don't need to think about it. So that's delivery. Okay. And the final stage of the project is its close down stage. And this stage is really important because the members of the project team are valuable resources. And in fact, they're probably now more valuable because they have the experience of planning and delivering this project. Now, the people who've worked on the project have probably learned something new virtually every day. And sometimes those lessons that have been learned will be very useful to the organisation if it ever runs a similar project again. For example, if a particular system has proven very difficult to test, recording that it was difficult to test and why it was difficult to test might help a future project to prepare for the difficulty. Now, some lessons that need to be learned might only need to be learned by one person. Perhaps the sponsor of the project needs to learn a lesson about sponsorship. Maybe some lesson needs to be learned by one small team. But there are perhaps some other lessons that actually the whole organisation needs to learn. And it's part of the project manager's role to ensure that lessons that might be useful are not lost. And one of the best ways to do this is to maintain a log of what lessons have been learned during the project on a weekly basis throughout the project. So it's not uncommon for projects to have to submit a weekly status report. And I got into the habit of every week after the weekly status report was done, I thought about what have we learned this week? And we logged those lessons that had been learned. And what that meant was in the close down stage, we had a list of all the lessons, all the things that we'd learned, and we could evaluate them to say, actually, what are the important lessons here? What do we need to pass on? Or what was trivial? And actually, it's reasonable for every project to have to relearn that lesson. Because we're trying to make the organisation more efficient. So, as I say, it's part of the project manager's job at the end of the project, during the close down stage, to identify what are the useful lessons that were learned during the project and to pass on those lessons that were learned to somebody that can make use of them. So we release the project team, this valuable project team, we release them to do other work, we pass on the lessons that were learned during the project, and we dismantle the project management structure. So the project manager goes back to the pool of project managers to await his assignment to a new project. The steering group meetings are ended and the sponsor no longer has to worry about the project because it's closed down. But it's quite important that we close down the project correctly so that we're clear what was delivered. If anything that we were supposed to deliver couldn't be delivered, the close down phase will record that there was something that couldn't be delivered, because that information could form the basis of a future project. And the reason why it wasn't delivered in this project could be important to the next project. And it's very often the case that we do write a closed down report. And just looking at time, it's taken a little bit longer than perhaps I thought to get through these slides. I've got quite a number of other slides and the assignments to move on to. So we might have to have another session on this just to finish off. But when we think about the deliverables of the closed down stage, there will normally be a closed down report that is a deliverable. And that closed down report will confirm that all the team's been released. It will confirm that the project management structure has been dismantled, and it will confirm what deliverables were and weren't delivered, so that if anything wasn't delivered, another project might be able to pick that up. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to go into this slide now because we actually have 4 more slides when we look in some more detail at what are the deliverables within each initiation stage. So what I'll do is I'll just flick through these things briefly so you can see what there is. I won't give you enough time to read them, but if you want to review the video on YouTube and get ahead of the game, you can, but I will set up another session to go through these deliverables because we need to understand these deliverables in a bit more detail. So these are the delivery stage deliverables. These are the closed down stage deliverables. And I'm going to come on to the assignment. Right, okay. So I'm going to give you assignment 3 now on the basis that you can look at the YouTube video to learn the names and purposes of the key deliverables on slides 11 through 14. And you can learn which stage they're normally part of. So there are 18 deliverables. In the next session, we'll come back and we'll discuss them in detail. But Assignment 3 is really an assignment in rote learning, and it's just really useful for you to learn what deliverables are created in what stage of the project. That knowledge will allow you to work effectively within a project team. It's very fundamental knowledge, so there's no harm in learning it as a piece of rote learning now, using the list of deliverables from the YouTube video. As I say, the YouTube video should be up there tomorrow. Probably I'll commit to getting it up there for midday tomorrow. So you've got until 7 p.m. on the 22nd of September to undertake that assignment. Just going to go on mute briefly.
Hi, Tony. Wait, I can't hear.
I'm sorry. Sorry, I was I needed to go on mute to cough, and then when I came off mute, it didn't come off successfully. Are you hearing me now?
Yes, Tony.
Oh, good. So sorry about that. So yes, I was saying that although you can look at the deliverables on the YouTube video, which I'll put up tomorrow from sort of lunchtime, I have actually got a separate list of the deliverables that I can send you. So I'll put a Word document on Telegram after this session that contains a list of key deliverables of each stage, and I'll put another Word document on which is a multiple choice test that I'd like you to complete. So what you need to do is you need to take the multiple choice test document, save it with your name at the end so that I can see whose is whose, and then you need to answer the questions by putting the letter that you think is the correct answer into the last column on the against the question. Save the document, and if you can share that document with the Knowledge Pool administrator on our G Drive by 7 o'clock next Tuesday, that would be great. Let me just check that the date is correct. Yeah, that's right. So I'll send you these two documents. One will be the list of key deliverables. The other one will be the test. If you can undertake that test and get that test back to me for 7 p.m. on the 22nd of September, that would be great. Is that okay? Okay, so welcome everybody. This is a continuation of the previous session where we were looking at the project lifecycle. And the session took a little bit longer to deliver last week than I was expecting. What we were able to do last week was look at each stage in turn, what the stage was called, and why the stage was required. And we looked at what the purpose of the stage was. I haven't posted the video of the session last week. What I was going to do was I'm recording the session this week, and I'm going to link the two videos together and post it as one session on YouTube, because this session is designed to be one session. We're supposed to cover the whole of the project lifecycle in one session. So I'm going to link the video together. So if you want to watch this on YouTube, it will be available there as one video. So we saw last week that we recommend having an initiation stage to every project. And it's in the initiation stage where you're making sure that you understand the problem that you're trying to solve. You make sure that you've understood the approach that you're going to take, and you have a view as to what the next phase of the project, what the planning stage is going to look like. So you have a plan for the planning stage. So what we need to look at now is we need to talk about some specific deliverables that can be created during the initiation stage. Because in order to achieve that purpose that we set for the initiation stage, we have to have some deliverables that help us do that. And the question was asked last week about where the project initiation document fits into this. And the project initiation document is a deliverable of the initiation stage that is often mandated within organizations. And the idea of the project initiation document is it's pulling together all of these strands of the purpose of the initiation stage. So we'll take a run through this list of deliverables and we'll talk about them, and then we can discuss which of these might actually be amalgamated together to form a project initiation document, because that's not uncommon to find some of these individual deliverables, they actually get included together in the project initiation document so that the project has one document that it's created by the end of initiation that really sets out what it's trying to do and how it's going to do it. So our first deliverable is a completed business case. And we mentioned last week that there's very often a startup period before the project actually gets going. So before the initiation stage, there is a period of startup. And in that startup, when the project is being conceived, a basic business case may be developed to justify why a project is needed. But it's during the initiation stage that we complete that business case. So it's in initiation when we look at all the rationale for the project and we look at financially, why is this project worth it to this business to do this project? And we have to consider both the cost of delivering the project, so what it might cost, but we also have to consider the business benefit in terms of what extra revenue or what extra profit it might bring to the business. So the business case often consists of, just bear with me 1 second. So Adebayo, I think you've just started sharing the high-level functional requirements for the CRM system. That's just overwritten my presentation. So I'm just going to take back control, if that's okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, Tony.
No worries. No worries. There we go. Can everyone see that initiation stage deliverables list now?
Yes.
Yeah. The way Teams is set up, I think people can overwrite these things if they need to. But if we can avoid doing that while I'm presenting the session, that will help us get through more quickly. So yeah, I was saying about the business case. So in the business case, we'll look at the financial positives of doing the project. So what revenue or profit the project might bring to the organization, but we'll also look at the cost that doing the project will bring. And that cost will be split into two kinds of cost. There will be a cost for the project itself, so how much it will cost the project to run, but then there might be other costs that once we've run that project, that the organization will then have to incur those costs. So say, for example, the project is to build a new contact center. After the project has delivered, there will be an ongoing cost to run that contact centre. There will be staff working there. There'll be equipment that needs to be replaced when the equipment becomes worn out. So when we're doing a business case, we need to think about the financial positives, but also the financial negatives of the project, both in terms of what the project will cost to run, but also how it will change the costs of the organisation going forwards. And the other thing that you will see in business cases, as well as financial information, is some information which some people might call soft information. And this is perhaps information about, we might run a project that might not create any particular financial benefit, but it might make the organisation more flexible and able to adapt to changing market conditions. But it may be difficult to put a value on that additional flexibility. So sometimes you'll see that a benefit is claimed for a project that can't be given a financial figure for it, but it's still a benefit. If people in the organisation agree that it's a benefit, it can be listed in the business case as a benefit. So the business case is there to say, why is the project needed? What's the rationale for doing this project? The next deliverable is some sort of statement of the problem to be solved. And we talked last week about how when we are thinking about the problem, very often what we have at the initiation stage is a vision of what a solution will look like and what the organisation will look like when it's solved its problem. And what we need to do is we need to take that vision and we need to decompose it into what are the specific outcomes that the business is trying to achieve. And then based on those outcomes, we need to further decompose it down to what are the deliverables that are needed in order to solve the problem. So in stating our problem, we are trying to define what our vision is of the problem and of the solution, and we're trying to define what our outcomes are, what we're trying to achieve. And in essence, we're trying to say what it is that the business needs from the project. As part of the statement of the problem, we're also looking at the scope of the problem, and we mentioned scope in the very first session where we talked about scope being the boundaries of the problem and all the different things that might be part of the problem. And we will look at scope in more detail in a future session, so don't worry too much about understanding what scope is, but it's basically the boundary of the problem, whether it affects people, whether it affects processes, whether it affects systems, whether it affects cash flow. All of these are aspects of the problem potentially. And in defining the problem, we are trying to make sure we understand the problem that the business has identified, because if you don't understand the problem, you're not going to solve it correctly. You're going to end up solving a slightly different problem, and that isn't going to produce the right outcomes and deliver the right vision for the business. So it's really important during the initiation stage at the start of the project that we identify exactly what the problem is that needs to be solved. But we also need to think about what our approach is to solving the problem. And we talked about how it was necessary during the initiation stage to decide on our approach, because the approach that we take will determine the sorts of tasks that we need in the project plan in order to deliver the project. If we take one sort of approach, we'll need one set of tasks. If we take a different approach, we'll need a different set of tasks. So it's a very good idea within the project's initiation stage to write down what the project's approach is to solving the problem. And we've been doing this with our CRM project. We can use the CRM project as an example, because our initial approach, we said we would look at the marketplace and find a CRM system that we could buy for a price that we could afford. That was our approach. But Ravi, via his contact with Sigma DX, opened up the prospect of another approach being viable for us, that approach being to build our own CRM using a suitable tool like Microsoft Power Apps. So in an agile organization, we should try and be flexible, but it is always a good idea to write down what our approach is at the outset to the project so that everyone can see how we're dealing with the problem. What is our approach to solving it? But once we've got an approach, we also need to think about what our solution is. And it's very often the case in business that we do need to design a solution. And the reason that we need to design a solution is we have to say what it is that needs to be built. We have to say how those things are going to interconnect with each other, how they're going to work together to produce the solution that we need. Because systems and processes are complicated. And when we come to build them, we need some sort of guidance as to how we're going to build them. So we need a design. And it's during the initiation stage that you would produce what would normally be called either a solution design or a high-level design. And that basically sets out the components that are needed within the solution. So it might say we need a system that's going to do this, and we need another system that's going to do that, and the two systems are going to talk to each other and exchange this sort of data. That would be the basis of a solution design or a high-level design. And it's really from that solution design that we discover finally all the deliverables that the project needs to build in order to solve the problem. Because it's our solution design that says what we need, and the project will build those things we need as its deliverables. So you can see there's a sort of logical flow to that we start by understanding why the project's needed. We then define clearly what the problem is we're trying to solve. We then define our approach to solving the problem, and we then define a solution that we think is going to solve the problem. And at that point, we have some deliverables that we know the project is going to have to build and probably test before we can solve the problem. The next things we need to move on to is we need to take an initial view of the risks that are facing the project, because any project will be faced with a number of risks. And if we're not aware of the risks that we're running, then some of those risks will come and hurt the project. It's inevitable that some of the risks we face will come and hurt the project. So when we've got our list of initial deliverables, we know what it is the project's going to do and how it's going to do it. We can look at that approach. We can look at how we're solving the problem. We can look at what deliverables we're building, and we can say, well, what are the risks? If we're going about solving the problem in this way, what sorts of risks are going to come and affect the project? One of the risks that we might have with our CRM project is that we only have Ravi that's done any development work on a CRM project. So we don't have a lot of resource and a lot of knowledge there. So there's a risk about the amount of skill we have that we can devote to that. If anything happens to Ravi, we could be very stuck for development resource. So we have a resource risk there around Ravi. We have another risk as well, which is that the software we pick can't actually meet our requirements, because we can evaluate the products, we can review them, but we don't actually know that they are capable of meeting our requirements until we actually try to use them to meet our requirements. So if we select a product and we spend money on it, then we're taking a risk, because we're not absolutely sure that that product can meet our requirements. By evaluating it, we hope to address a lot of the risk. So one of our ways that we mitigate the risk is that we do our research, we evaluate products, we read the literature, about the product, we perhaps read third-party reviews about the product, and it's those things that we do that reduce the risk. But one of our deliverables during the initiation stage should be that initial view of the risks that are facing the project. And risk will normally be captured into a risk log. And what we do with the risk log is, over the life of the project, we capture new risks into the risk log, and we keep evaluating the risks that are in the risk log. Some risks can't really affect the project until quite late in the project. Some risks can affect the project quite early on, and it's useful for us to know whether risks can affect the project early on, in which case we might give them a bit more attention, or if we know that they can't affect the project till very late in the project, perhaps around implementation time, we might actually delay giving the risk much consideration, because we're still in the initiation stage. We're nowhere near implementation. So we would start our risk log during the initiation stage, and that would be one of our deliverables, would be that initial list of risks in the risk log. And we do have a separate session on risk management where we'll look at project risk in a lot more detail. So we'll go on to discuss risks in the risk log in more detail in future. The next deliverable that certainly I found it very useful to have is something that is sometimes called a project charter, or sometimes it's called a terms of reference. And what the project charter does is it defines the management structure for the project. So it will say who is in charge. It will say that there's a project manager. It will say what the project manager is responsible for. It will say whether there's a project sponsor, so somebody from the business who is going to champion the project. It will say whether there is going to be a project steering group. And if there is going to be a steering group, it will say what the steering group can decide, what the sponsor can decide, and perhaps what those decision-making groups can't do. So they may give the sponsor a limit on money that he can spend on the project. If the project needs more money than that, if the project charter says the sponsor can't approve any more money, then the sponsor will have to go to the next level within the organisation, a level above the project, in order to get the additional funding that they need. And I found it very useful to have a project charter or a terms of reference that does set out the management structure for the project and what level of decision each management thing can take. So it will say what the project manager can decide, it will say what the sponsor can decide, and it will say what the steering group can decide. And there may be other management groups that are set up to support the project. On a very large project, there may be a design group where a number of different designers come together in order to talk about the design of the solution. And the project charter would say something like the design group can agree changes to the design, providing the cost is less than X and the time that it will take to make the change is less than X. So it will give some parameters that allows any decision-making forum to understand whether they're going to make a decision that they're allowed to, or if they're not allowed to, where they can take that question as to whether they can make the decision or not. Because if they can't make the decision, it will have to go higher up within the organisation. So the project charter is a common deliverable within the initiation stage. And we mentioned previously as well that we should have a plan for the next stage. So the next stage after initiation is called planning. So we need a plan for the planning stage. And it's in the planning stage that we determine what the activities and resources, it's in the plan that we determine the activities, the resources and the money that are needed to build the deliverables that are needed from the planning stage. And on the next slide, we'll look at what those particular deliverables are that are normally built in the planning stage. So when we're constructing the plan for the planning stage, we're thinking about what activities, resource and money are needed to build the deliverables for the planning stage. But we also then need to think about, based on the risks that we've identified, are there any extra activities or resources or money that would be necessary to mitigate the risks that we face? Because it's all very well identifying risks, but if we do nothing to reduce them, then the impact that they have on the project could be significant. So when we're planning, we're not only thinking about the things we must do, we're also thinking about, are there any extra activities we want to do in order to address the risks that we've identified? And our final plan will be that list of things we need to do to create the deliverables, but also things we need to do to address the risks that we face. And then the final deliverable of the initiation stage will be what we would call committed resource and funding. So the plan says what you need. The committed resource and the funding is approval to have the resource, to have the people, and to have the money that your plan says you need. So if your plan says you need 3 business analysts, your committed resource is somebody who controls the work of business analysts committing that you have 3 business analysts available to work on your project from a certain date. So that resource is committed to you for your planning stage. And in a similar way, the finance section of the organisation will confirm that you have the funding that you need for the planning stage. And we mentioned last week that funding is often approved in stages because that's a very good technique for controlling risk. If all the funding for a project was confirmed at the outset, the risk is that the project manager or the project team might spend all of that money during the planning stage and not actually deliver anything. So by releasing the funding in stages, the organisation retains some control over the project. So it's often the case that funding is released in stages, and the last stage of initiation will be where you get confirmation that you have the people you need and you have the money you need for the next stage. That means the next stage can begin. If you don't have the money and you don't have the people, you can't begin the next stage. What you need to do is find out why you can't get the people or deal with why you can't get the funding. So they're the standard deliverables within the initiation stage, but some organizations do combine these together into a project initiation document, so that there is one deliverable that the project can point to say, this is how we're going to start the project. And all of these deliverables that we've got on here might be included in a project initiation document. The only thing that couldn't be included in the project initiation document would actually be the committed resource or funding, although there might be a note in the project initiation document to say that funding has been approved and resource has been committed. So different organisations mandate different composition for their project initiation documents. So lots of places I've worked will actually have the business case as a separate document, and they will always keep the business case as a separate document, but they might copy part of the business case into the project initiation document again, so that you've got just one document you can give people that explains why the project's needed, what the problem is that we're trying to solve, what approach we're taking, what our design is, what risks we face, how the management structure for the project is organised, and what our plan for the planning stage looks like. So that's the initiation stage and its deliverables. Are there any questions before we move on? Okay. So these are our planning stage deliverables. So during the planning stage, we need to delve down into the problem some more. So we go down to a lower level of detail than we did during initiation to understand the problem. And the way we do that is to look at what the business requirements are. What is it that the business needs in detail from the project? If we're using Agile, then this process of gathering business requirements can be truncated in that we can gather only the most essential must-have requirements during the planning stage, confident in the knowledge that the more detailed requirements can be gathered during the delivery phase. So gathering the business requirements and documenting them and prioritizing them is a deliverable of the planning stage, but the level that we go to will be determined by whether we're using Agile or a more traditional waterfall approach. The next thing we need to deliver during planning stage is a completed design. So during initiation, we came up with a high-level design, but it's rarely the case that we can finish the design during initiation. Usually there's too much work to be done. We need to spend more time on it. We might even need more resource. We might need a wider range of designers and experts in order to actually design the solution we need. So completing our design is often left to the planning stage. The next thing we need to do is, when projects deliver things, we also need to worry about the quality of those deliverables. And so we need to have a deliverable that is either a plan to test the deliverables, or it's sometimes called a quality plan. And the purpose of the quality plan is to confirm that the deliverables meet the requirements. So the plan for testing our deliverables, our quality plan, will say how we're going to take our deliverables and how we're going to test them against the requirements. Because our requirements will say we need to be able to do this. And so in order to prove that the deliverables that we've created are capable of meeting the requirement, we have to do some testing. And the quality plan is a plan for how we're going to test the deliverables to confirm that they meet our requirements. The next deliverable will be an updated view of risks, because as we've defined more requirements, as we've refined our designs, and as we've planned how we're going to test those deliverables to see that they meet the requirements, we will discover new risks, we'll discover more risks. And the risks that we found during initiation, we may have learned more about them. Our mitigating actions that we put into the plan for the planning stage may not have been successful. We may need to do more to mitigate the risk, or the possibility of the risk hurting the project may have passed. So one of the deliverables is an updated view of the risks. So what we'll do typically during the planning stage is there might well be a workshop where we think specifically about the risks that we now know are facing the project. And as a result of that workshop, we will update the risk log to show that we've recognised some new risks. Some old risks may have dropped off or changed, but we have that updated view of risks. The next thing we need is a plan for the delivery and the close down stages. And I mentioned last week that we create the plan for the close down stage during the planning stage, because the close down stage is a really small stage, and it's quite easy to plan it. So we take this opportunity to plan the close down stage now as an efficiency measure to avoid us having to plan the close down stage at the end of delivery. The end of delivery can be quite a busy time for the project because it's implementing all of its deliverables, and despite all the testing that we may have done, it's not unheard of for deliverables to have problems when they're actually used by the business for the first time. And the project will tend to be focused on solving those problems, and it won't be worrying too much about the close down stage and planning that. So we take this opportunity during planning stage to plan for the delivery stage and the close down stage. And what the plan is doing is it's saying what are the activities, resources, and money that we need to build the deliverables for the delivery and close down stages, but also to think about those extra activities and resources and money that we need in order to mitigate any new risks that we found. So you can see that in order to build our plan, we have to have already done our review of risks, because we need to consider any new risks that we face in our plan. And then the very last deliverable, again, is this idea of some committed resource and some committed money to allow the delivery stage to start, because you shouldn't end the planning stage until you're sure you're ready for the delivery stage to start. So that's the planning stage. And in terms of deliverables, the business requirements will tend to be one document. The design will tend to be another document, or possibly a number of documents. The plan for testing will be its own document. The updated view of risks will be within the risk log that we've created already, and there will be a plan for the delivery and the close down stage. The committed resource and funding isn't a document as such. It's that actual resource being available to you and the money being available to you. So, are there any questions about the planning stage deliverables before we move on? Okay. So, we come to the delivery stage deliverables. And we've taken a bit of a shortcut here, which is to say that one of the things that needs to be delivered during the delivery stage is all the deliverables that are needed by the business. And we've determined what those deliverables are in the planning stage. So in the planning stage, we've said the business needs A, it needs B, it needs C. So our delivery stage deliverables consist of A, B, and C, because they're the deliverables we need to achieve those outcomes that were sought in our original statement of the problem. But it's often the case as well that there is another deliverable that we always need, and that's an implementation plan. And the implementation plan is there to ensure that we safely release these deliverables that we've built during the delivery stage into live service, and that we support the business while it adapts to the change that's involved in using those deliverables. So an implementation plan is a very common, almost mandatory deliverable within the delivery stage, because it guides us as to how to safely implement the change into the live business. So, are there any questions on the delivery stage deliverables? As I say, we took a shorthand with this in terms of saying, well, the deliverables of the delivery stage are everything that's needed by the business to solve the project. But we're assuming there that those deliverables have been defined, and they've been clearly defined by the work that was done in planning and also during initiation. The only time when those deliverables should be unclear is if you're using the agile methodology, when you can go into the delivery stage not quite sure what your deliverables are going to be. But using Agile, what you would know is how much time you would spend building those deliverables. And the delivery stage will end when that time runs out. The challenge for the project is to ensure that it's delivered all of the must-have requirements before the time runs out. The project can, having delivered all of the must-have requirements, it can take a decision to end, or it can take a decision while it has funding approved and time available to carry on gathering new requirements and making changes to implement those requirements with the business. That's down to the project's steering group and its sponsor to decide if it's using Agile. Does the project want to stop early, or is it going to run to its planned conclusion? But the only time that the deliverables to be created during the delivery stage would be unclear as you come into delivery would be if you're using Agile. That's the only time. So any questions on delivery stage? Okay. So the close down stage we've mentioned is short. There are really only two deliverables that you tend to actually see in the close down stage. One is a close down report that measures the success of the project. It also reports anything that couldn't be delivered by the project. And I would recommend that it also confirms that all the invoices raised by the project have been paid, because the project isn't closed until all its finances have been dealt with. So paying invoices tends to be the last activity, because it takes suppliers some time usually to send the invoices in. It takes time for the invoices to arrive at the project manager for approval. So paying the invoices tends to be the last thing that the project manager does. And once that's done, that will be the end of the project. So it's useful to know in the close down report either that all the invoices have been paid, or if there is an invoice which hasn't been paid for some reason, perhaps it's in dispute, that can be recorded. And what I would recommend is, if there is anything that is open, an open issue at the end of the project, like an invoice that hasn't been paid, or some problem with a deliverable, the project manager should make sure that the close down report refers to that, but also it should name the manager in the business that problem has been handed off to. The project shouldn't close and just leave problems in the business. It should hand those problems to a suitable manager within the business who can deal with that problem. And the close down report should record who the problem was given to and the fact that they accepted it. Because again, you don't want to be unclear as to whether somebody has accepted responsibility for solving a problem that the project has created. So the other, the other deliverable then is our lessons learned report. And we mentioned that as a project is progressing, it will learn lessons throughout the life of the project. It will learn lessons during initiation, during planning, during delivery, and possibly even during close down. If, for example, it is having difficulty handing a particular open issue off to some manager in the business, that could also be a lesson learned about how difficult that particular activity is. So the project can learn lessons throughout its life, but it should log them so that at the end of the project, a lessons learned report can be produced where the lessons that are going to be useful to the organisation in future, or to a future project that's working in the same area, those lessons need to be made available to the next project that might need them. So if somebody is considering that perhaps we need a new project for a new CRM system, they might look at the lessons learned report for our current CRM project to see what problems we had. And it's with that process of learning about problems that organizations improve. So there are just 2 deliverables within the close down stage, and that would be our lessons learned report and the close down report. Are there any questions on these deliverables?
Hi, Tony.
Hi.
I was going to ask about the end project report.
Yes.
Is it the same thing as the close down report? Yeah.
It is, yes. Yeah, so the end project and close down report are different names for the same thing. The other name you might hear is something called a post-implementation review. Now, a post-implementation review is similar to a close down report, but it's really looking at the implementation that happened and whether the implementation was successful. So the post-implementation review might identify some problems. What happens to those problems is then an interesting question, because those problems might be reported in the close down report if the project can't solve them, or the project may undertake more delivery work. It may build some new deliverables or change some existing deliverables in order to fix problems that were identified in a post-implementation review. But a post-implementation review is really looking at the implementation to say whether the implementation was a success, and if not, what problems there were, whereas the end project report or the close down report is looking more widely at the whole project. So it's looking at right from the very beginning to the very end. How did the project work? Was the project successful?
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So those are our deliverables, and we set an assignment last week, which was to learn those deliverables, because it's actually really important that you know what you should be creating at any particular stage in the project. If you aspire to work in projects, if you can arrive in a project and you can have a conversation with the project manager or with other business analysts to say, well, where are our requirements held? What does our design look like? Where's our risk log? It means that you're asking all the right questions. So it's definitely worth learning these deliverables. There are only 18, and there is some logic to them as to how they fit together. And this assignment noted that there were 8 deliverables during initiation, 6 in planning, and 2 in both delivery and close down. So we sent you a quiz as well, or a test to do that. I haven't had chance, I'm afraid, to actually look to see whether you've delivered those assignments. So apologies for that. I will look on Thursday. I'm busy tomorrow, but I will look on Thursday to see what assignments are there. So you actually have another 48 hours to get those, sorry, another 24 hours to get those assignments in if you want the marking. So that was assignment 3. There's also another assignment that I'd like to set for you. And this assignment is helping you start think about the sorts of lessons that you might learn on a project and the sort of lesson that you might need to log as the project is going along, so that when it's time to create your lessons learned report, you don't have to try to remember everything that the project did and learned. You can actually just go to your log. You've got all the lessons. I found it particularly useful because I was required on pretty much every project I worked on to submit a weekly status report. After I'd done my status report, I would think about what lessons had been learned that week, and I would make a note of them. Then when it came to do the lessons learned report, I had all those lessons noted down. So I'd like you to consider this scenario. So you're a project manager and you're running a project to change an IT system. And when your team has released its tested software to the live system, there was a problem. And the problem was that the instructions for loading the software onto the live system didn't work because the system where the software had been tested was slightly different to the live system. So I'd like you to think about that scenario and what lesson you think we should learn from that. And I'd like you to describe the lesson as your assignment. So there's some instructions for you. So I'd like you to create a new Word document, call it PM Assignment 4, but put your name at the end and save the document so it has your name. And then in the document, describe the lesson that you think should be learned from the scenario above. So you need to think about what went wrong and what lesson could be learned from that. What could we do differently to avoid that problem in future? And then save the document and share that document back to the Knowledge Pool G Drive. And if I could, I need to just change the date on this for you because I'd intended that we would set this assignment last week. So this date is wrong. If I asked you to deliver that assignment for the 24th of September, that's just 2 days' time. Is that too tight for people? Do you need longer for this? Or is 2 days enough?
I think we need longer.
Yeah, okay. Right. In which case, I'll give you till Tuesday of next week, which will be the 29th of September, yeah?
Great. Okay.
Yeah, no problems. I appreciate people are busy and they've got lots of things to do. So we'll say the 29th of September for that one, and we'll say the 24th of September for assignment 3, and then I'll mark that and you'll have your feedback for next week. Okay, so that's assignment 4. And then we've just got a summary then of the project life cycle. So we saw last week that there is this period that we call startup, which is what happens even before the project starts. And it's where the project is conceived. Somebody decides we need a project to do something. And it's in startup usually where an initial business case is created and a project manager is assigned and possibly a lead business analyst is assigned, but some resources assigned to get the project started because the project can't do anything until there are people to work on it. And then during the initiation stage, we make sure we understand the business case for the project, the problem we're trying to solve, the vision and the outcomes we want, what design we need, what approach we need, what risk we face, and we come up with a plan for the planning stage. And then during planning, we make sure we understand all the detailed requirements. We've done all our detailed designs. We've worked out how we're going to test our deliverables to make sure that they do meet the requirements. And we have a plan for delivery. And we have an updated view of all the risks that we're facing. Obviously, in delivery, we build all the deliverables, we test them, and we implement them into the business. And then we close down the project and we tear down the management structure that was set up during initiation. And this technique of splitting the project into stages has been proven over many years to be a very good control of risk because it stops the project getting ahead of itself. It stops it trying to deliver solutions before it really understands the problem. And it makes sure that risks are properly considered and things like that. So this is why we split projects up into these stages. And in order for these stages to work, we've defined their purpose, and we discussed the purpose of each stage in detail last week. But to make sure that that purpose can be achieved, there are some specific deliverables that we always need. And we've discussed those this week, and we've set you an assignment to learn what those deliverables are, because they're just so important and fundamental to how projects work.